Welcome to the virtual Artful Bodies tour of the Worcester Art Museum. I'm Katerina Teves, and I'm a student at the College of the Holy Cross. In this section of the tour, I'll be talking about St. Catherine by Giulio Cesare Procaccini. Before we jump into Procaccini's painting, let's talk about the subject, St. Catherine. St. Catherine of Alexandria was born in the late 3rd century and martyred in the early 4th century. Born into a family of pagan tradition, she eventually converted to Christianity and became a fervent advocate. She was an exceptionally bright and articulate person, and was known as a scholar. She confronted Emperor Maxentius about the persecution of Christians. Unfortunately, he was not moved, but instead sentenced her and everyone she helped convert to death. Initially, St. Catherine was tied to a spiked wheel, but while she was in it, she was rescued by divine intervention, some say by a lightning bolt from heaven, and the spiked wheel was broken. However, this didn't stop Maxentius, and St. Catherine was later beheaded. Now that we know the saint's backstory, let's move on to the painting. Let's take a closer look at the painting. Procaccini portrays St. Catherine in a dramatic scene, at the moment she has been freed from the spiked wheel. By doing so, he emphasizes the mysteriousness and power of heaven and captures the saint in a moment of wonder, vulnerability, and ecstasy. Like many other Baroque painters, Procaccini uses dramatic lighting to emphasize and illuminate St. Catherine. The light seems to come from above. The viewer's gaze is directed up at St. Catherine's. We see the glimmer of light reflected in her eye as she looks up. In using dramatic lighting, Procaccini directs the viewer's attention to the saint and the heavens. St. Catherine has just been saved by divine intervention from the spiked wheel. It is a physical proof of God's powerfulness. The light reflected off the metal spikes of the wheel and the chain around her stomach calls the viewer's attention back to the violence that has almost just taken place, and emphasizes that no man-made device can conquer faith. By painting her in the torture device, Procaccini presents St. Catherine as vulnerable and susceptible to man's violence. She is exposed, half naked with her dress around her waist. She covers her chest with her arms and pulls the shirt or veil around her. In painting her like this, Procaccini stresses her vulnerability. Conversely, one might also argue that Procaccini depicts St. Catherine in a moment of ecstasy. Her expression is reminiscent of Bernini's St. Teresa of Avila, and reflects the bliss one can gain through one's faith. Through her faith, she has been saved by God and has achieved this pleasure. Her posture is almost sensuous. Her loose hair cascades down her back and down her bare chest, and she holds herself in wonder. It is only with a glance at the chains around her waist when we remember that violence has almost occurred. The vulnerability, ecstasy, and violence of St. Catherine are conflicting and make Procaccini's portrayal complex and intriguing. By making St. Catherine complex and intriguing, Procaccini draws the viewer into the drama of the moment and allows the viewer to empathize with her. Procaccini paints St. Catherine realistically. She looks extremely lifelike. The top exposed part of her body looks fleshy and has a skin-like texture. She's human and fleshy like us, and with this similarity, we can relate to her and empathize with her situation more. We can connect to her because of this. She is a physical, transient being. By painting St. Catherine like this, Procaccini seems to be suggesting that we, too, can achieve the spiritual connection she has made. Religious art like St. Catherine was popular in the 17th century. Let's step back from the painting and see what was going on when it was made. St. Catherine was created in the early 17th century during an artistic period called the Baroque. Through the use of dramatic lighting, bright and warm colors, movement, and balanced compositions, artists such as Bernini and Caravaggio, the top Baroque artists, captured often emotional and intense moments in time. Beginning in the 16th century and continuing into the 17th century, the Catholic Counter-Reformation grew out of Rome and spread through Europe. It was a reaction against the many branches of Catholicism, such as Protestantism, that had grown recently, and it was also a movement to strengthen the Church. The Roman Catholic Church needed to strengthen the faith of believers and also draw in those who had strayed into other branches of Catholicism, and art was the perfect way to do this. In turn, the Roman Catholic Church became a sort of unofficial patron of religious art, and thus painting of religious scenes increased throughout Europe. This religious art would shepherd people to a better relationship with God by vividly presenting the suffering and devotion of saints, martyrs, and Jesus. Contrary to what you might think, the Catholic Church actually endorsed the depiction of ecstasy in religious art. It was another way to make followers connect to the saints' spiritual experiences. Ecstasy began to be related to spirituality in the late Middle Ages and was originally thought of as rapture. However, later, ecstasy came to be understood as being completely removed from your senses. To be in ecstasy was to be completely spiritually absorbed. An artwork's portrayal of ecstasy could be both spiritual and sexual in nature, as made famous by Bernini's Ecstasy of St. Teresa of Avila. Its sexual nature of ecstasy allows viewers to relate St. Teresa's spiritual experience on a physical level. Like with St. Teresa, some might interpret St. Catherine as having an expression of ecstasy. This would make her more of a physical being and allow followers to connect with her experience more. This is how people might view this painting back then. But what about modern perspectives? When I first saw St. Catherine, the first word that came to my mind was sensual. It was the way she holds herself in the painting that caught my attention. However, I began to see her more complexly when I recognized the violent situation she was potentially in. My personal response led me to think about the portrayal of ecstasy in religious art and what role religious art plays today in the 21st century. When I asked other people what they thought of ecstasy in religious art, most of them replied that they were not completely comfortable with it. When I asked them what role they thought religious art has today, they all agreed that it is less influential than it was in the past, and that people are less religious and more liberal today. But how do past and present connect? During the Counter-Reformation, religious art, even works that depicted expressions of ecstasy, was supported by the Church because it was a way to reach believers and help them achieve a spiritual connection with God. It was a way to help followers relate to important individuals in Christian history and to make those individuals human and physical. Portrayals of ecstasy also helped with this because it was another way for viewers to physically relate to the saint's spiritual experience. One can easily see the sensuousness of St. Catherine. Today, the Church is not actively fighting its many branches, and thus religious art is not as needed, and portrayals of ecstasy not as accepted, as there is less of a need to relate to believers in this way. Because of this, followers seem to be less comfortable with religious art containing ecstatic expression. In the 21st century, Catholic religious art seems to be more abstract and conceptual, relying less on lifelike figures to convey a spiritual message. Thanks for watching this video. To find out more about St. Catherine, click on the links in the sidebar.